welcome to Crawlspace. I'm Tim here today with Lance. Lance, how are you today?
I'm doing fantastic today. I hope all the listeners are doing fantastic as well. The conversation that we have coming up is a morbidly educational conversation. Dare I say fun? It's a very fun conversation. We learned a ton about poisons. But Tim, I'm fascinated with how you're doing today. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks a lot for asking. Yeah, very excited to introduce this conversation with author Deborah Blum. And Lance, she's no lightweight. She is a Pulitzer Prize-winning science journalist, best-selling author of 6 books, and we primarily speak with her about a book called The Poison Squad. And Lance, she's also the director of the Knight Science Journalism Program at MIT, the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, right down the street from us, so no big deal over here.
And Tim, if we have one more Pulitzer Prize winner on the show, I think the Pulitzer Committee is just going to have to give us an honorary one. I'd love to get a Pulitzer.
I think so, and I think we're not really joking about this anymore.
No, we deserve it. We've deserved it for a long time, especially when we bring guests like this to the conversation, to the airwaves. We're able to have this discussion with Deborah, and she gives us this history of poison, how it was used, how it's been misused, all of the different poisons. And she does this really fun thing, this cool thing where she animates them into personalities in her mind when she writes about them, when she considers them and does research. Pretty cool to hear somebody talk about this. Someone who appreciates, as she says, efficiency not only in poison, but in all levels of work and all aspects of life. She just happens to be very fascinated in the uses and misuses of all sorts of poisons.
Very cool. Well, I hope you enjoy this conversation with Deborah Blum. You can pick up any of her books at her website. That's deborahblum.com. There'll be links in the show notes. And please follow us on social media at Crawlspace Podcast or Crawlspace Pod.
All right, we're going to break real quick for commercial, and we'll be right back to discuss all the poisons with Professor Deborah Blum.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program. Welcome to the podcast, Deborah Blum. How are you today?
I'm good. It's raining in Boston, but that's normal. So.
It's raining. It's super foggy too, and I think that like sets the mood for our conversation that we're about to have with you today. I honestly don't know where to start. You've written so much, and you've won a Pulitzer Prize, for God's sake. Like, you've just done so much. But for anybody out there who does not know who you are, can you fill our listeners in a little bit?
Sure. So I'm a longtime science journalist. Started in California. Am now at MIT, where I run the Knight Science Journalism Program here, publish a magazine called Undark, and I'm a toxicology journalist. I have been writing about poisons and ways to kill people, I guess, since 2010, when The Poisoner's Handbook, which was my first book on the subject, came out. And I've spent the last 15 years really focusing on chemistry and poison in our everyday life. I'm not interested in the abstract of it. I'm interested in the way these chemical compounds run through our lives in a kind of everyday way. So Poisoner's Handbook, I did a book on food safety, which is also about poison, called The Poison Squad. And I'm now working on a book about female serial killers and poisoners, which is tentatively titled The Weapon, Women and Poison in Our Murderous World.
Amazing work that you've done on everything. And we had spoken with our friend Daniel Stone. And when I say our friend, we're all mutual acquaintances of Daniel Stone. And he recently released a new book called American Poison. And he mentioned a couple of characters, Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler. And the second that those characters came up, we just did some research, and the research led to you, which led to this conversation. So I just love how these things come together. I just mentioned Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler. Can you fill us in a little bit on these two guys?
Sure. Charles Norris and Alexander Gettler are the heroes, I guess you would say, of my first book, The Poisoner's Handbook. And they were two very underpaid civil servants working in New York City in the early 20th century. And both of them, in their different ways, dedicated to the idea that we had to figure out how to catch poisoners. And one of the things that's so interesting about their story is that I think we underestimate how recent what I think of as our CSI age is, right? In the early 20th century, we really did not know how to catch poisoners. And in fact, in 1918, when Charles Norris started as the first chief medical examiner in New York City, the city actually published a report that said the clever poisoner can operate with impunity in New York City. I wouldn't have put that out publicly, but they were really looking at some of the problems of catching poisoners. So Norris and Gettler, and my book is about this, spent the next almost 20 years working their way through sort of the pantheon of poisons in American life and figuring out how to catch killers. And I should say, one of the things that makes them so interesting is, one, they had disappeared. So it's always really fun as a writer to find someone whose story has vanished and sort of bring them back to life. But the other is that they were interested in poison, and so am I, not just as a homicidal weapon, but as a fact of living in our industrial chemical age. So Daniel Stone's book, American Poison, which is absolutely wonderful book about leaded gasoline, largely focused on trying to figure that out. They looked at the very toxic nature of lead in gasoline. They actually persuaded New York City to ban lead in gasoline in 1925. It was overruled by what I think of as our very corrupt federal government, right, which was sort of hand in glove with the gas and auto industry. They looked at radium. Right? If you know the story of the Radium Girls, that was one of theirs. They looked at tobacco smoke and air pollution. They looked at all kinds of issues in which poison is just part of our lives. And they did this is a long answer to your question, a really good job figuring out how to catch killers. Gettler's work on cyanide, for instance, was so groundbreaking. Like the EPA still cites Gettler's work on cyanide because it's so good, and he published that in the 1930s. I think they're heroes. Sorry, I have to get that in there.
What was it about his work on cyanide that was groundbreaking? Like, what didn't we know about cyanide before he came forward with this information?
I think part of what he focused on was more, how do we detect it? How do we figure out how it enters the body? He looked at the different forms of cyanide. So cyanide itself, at its most basic, is a naturally occurring plant alkaloid. Everyone always gets this out of murder mysteries, but peach pits and apricot pits and bitter almonds and bay laurel leaves, right? It's actually part of a defense system that plants gin up. And we learned how to sort of synthesize that probably in the 19th century, but we couldn't figure out how to detect it in a corpse. And in fact, we didn't actually figure out how to detect plant alkaloids in a human body until I want to say about the 1870s. And then it was still a matter of, well, there were many forms of cyanide. There's hydrogen cyanide, which is a gas, right? Famous from the Nazis' use of hydrogen cyanide gas chambers in World War II. There's sodium cyanide. There's potassium cyanide, which is famous, if you really get into the weeds of our homicidal history, as the poison that was used in the Tylenol murders. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
Right? That series of sort of random killings by putting cyanide into Tylenol capsules in Chicago, that was potassium cyanide. So when you really look at Gettler's paper, what he's doing is he's saying, here's what we know about these different forms of cyanide. Here's what we know about how they enter the body, and here's how we test for them. And he really started that because of a very peculiar case in which a couple died of hydrogen cyanide poisoning, and they missed it at first. And he spent the next 15 years, he was a very obsessive guy, picking apart the ways that cyanide enter the body, picking apart the ways you look for it, and eventually picking apart the way you can catch a cyanide killer. And today we really can catch cyanide killers. Doesn't matter the form, doesn't matter the delivery system. We know how to do this.
You mentioned that a couple had died from hydrogen cyanide poisoning. And I'm wondering if cyanide poisoning was very popular back then. Was that a popular way that killers killed people?
That's such a good question. Cyanide was really readily available back then. The couple I was mentioning were actually the victims of a mishandled pesticide application. They actually used to use hydrogen cyanide gas to kill pests, right? Which is a really bad idea.
It's a really irresponsible thing to do.
Just a terrible thing, and is now outlawed, right? Which is why we need some of this stuff regulated. Cyanide was easily available. It was actually used in like silver polishes and photo processing. Strychnine was a popular tonic, a kind of pick-me-up tonic. So you could just go and get that from your doctor. Probably the most common poison at the time was arsenic trioxide. right? And arsenic trioxide was just in everything for a while, right? Starting in the late 19th century, it was used in everything from cosmetics to rat poisons to food coloring. And one of the wonderful things about arsenic, which is my personal favorite poison, but one of the wonderful things about arsenic trioxide is that it's odorless and tasteless, and it mimics the symptoms of a natural illness. So you could get it without suspicion, right? I'm just going to go get a little Fowler's solution, which was a cosmetic preparation that made your skin more beautiful and pale because you were being poisoned by arsenic. And I can put it in my husband's coffee and he's never going to taste it. And he's just going to get a sore throat and then a sore stomach. It's going to be misdiagnosed as a gastroenteritis, which happened all the time. So that was really why cyanide, at least in the 19th century, was known as the inheritance powder. And it continued as the number one homicidal poison, probably to about the mid-1950s.
Did you say the inheritance powder? Meaning like
Yes.
You'll get the inheritance after it does its job?
That's right. Across England, it was called the inheritance powder. I mean, across Europe, in France, poudre de succession.
That's amazing.
Why are these topics interesting to you?
I find poisons really fascinating in this way. I'm a failed chemistry major. I failed at chemistry, mostly because, I was just a klutz in the lab. I didn't pay attention enough. I set my hair on fire. I accidentally generated a toxic cloud in my undergraduate chemistry laboratory, which really anyone could do. And so I left chemistry for something in which I didn't think I was going to kill people, but I love it. But here's the thing. We live in a chemical world, right? I'm sitting here right now inhaling a raft of different compounds. I'm drinking coffee, which has a raft of different chemical compounds, and I'm fine because most chemical compounds sustain us, support us, are good for us, or are not dangerous, right? So poisons, to be dangerous, have to be really devious in the way they trick the body. They're complicated, devious chemical compounds. They unlock your body in ways and make it do things it really shouldn't do. And that was really fascinating to me very early on as I understood chemistry. And then poisoners are like that. They're really devious killers. You cannot have an impulse homicidal poisoning, right? You don't lose your temper, then rush out to research the best poison and how to deliver it in the way that I was just describing arsenic. So poisoners are devious and planners. Chemical compounds, which are poisons, are devious. And the two together to me was kind of irresistible. I wanted to, and this is also part of Poisoner's Handbook, write a book in which poisons were characters. I wanted to illuminate the actual personality of poisons. I animate them in my head as having personalities.
Interesting. Like, what type of personality does arsenic have in your head?
It's super sneaky, right? But one of the things I think about arsenic is if you think about, a killer that's multi-talented, can kill in many different ways, right? Sort of your ideal serial killer if you were going to make it a person. Arsenic is just like that. It's a multi-talented poison in all kinds of amazing ways. And just to dwell on it for a minute, arsenic is a naturally occurring element. It's the 33rd most common element in the Earth's crust. It's an element that likes to hold hands with other elements, right? So arsenic trioxide, which I've been talking about, which is the poison that everyone knows. We say arsenic, we mean arsenic trioxide, right? That's what the Borgias used. That was the inheritance powder. It's sort of a handshake between arsenic and oxygen. 3 oxygens, 2 arsenics, right? Arsenic at an acute level, arsenic trioxide, say at an acute level, which is that I'm going to kill you quickly, about half a teaspoon or so will kill an adult. But at very tiny levels, arsenic is naturally occurring. It's in rocks, it's in water. At very, very tiny levels, arsenic can kill you more slowly. So the EPA drinking water level for arsenic is 10 parts per billion. Right. So interesting to look at these early, decision makings on that 10 part per billion level, because they basically say it ought to be 3. Arsenic's really dangerous at a part per billion level, but that's too expensive for municipal water systems. So we're going to set it at 10. We're going to accept that X number of additional people will die because we did that. And we know arsenic is dangerous at that level because it's naturally occurring. It gets into water systems where there's a lot of arsenic in the bedrock. A classic example of that was in Taiwan, I want to say in the 1970s or so. They had an epidemic of something called Blackfoot disease, which was gangrene. And that's because naturally occurring arsenic got into the groundwater at a part per million level. It's so destructive to the cardiovascular system that they had a breakdown of blood vessels in people's feet, and they had gangrene in their feet. Right. So arsenic at a very tiny level is very dangerous, and at a very high level just kills you. Somewhere in between there, if I am a very devious poisoner and I want you to slowly get sick, I can use arsenic to do that too. Give you a subacute dose and watch you get sicker and sicker till the doctor concludes that you have, some GI illness and writes you off. Right. I know I sound creepy. I always think when I'm talking about this, man, I sound so creepy, but it is such a talented poison. And I admire efficiency. I admire efficiency in people, and I admire efficiency in poisons.
Yeah, no, it's not creepy. It definitely fits into our show, so that's good. And I can't wait to talk about more like specific examples of people who have used arsenic for those purposes. But you did mention the Borgias.
I did.
Okay, let's take ourselves back to that time in the world. How much of the craziness back then can we attribute to accidental poisoning?
Oh, that's a good question, too. Yeah, I mean, there were lots of accidental poisonings. You had all of these poisons, in your everyday life. People were exposed to them all the time. I know I'm going forward from the Borgias for a minute, but in the 19th century, when there was like this sort of cultural business love affair with arsenic, they actually used to use arsenic to make candles burn longer. And the doctors in the 19th century called them corpse candles. People would just be, lighting arsenic-rich candles at the dinner table and inhaling arsenic gas. It's so stupid. But so yes, there were all kinds of accidental poisonings, and not just with arsenic, but other chemical exposures. The Borgias themselves, I think, get something of a bad rap, right? I mean, I certainly think that Lucretia Borgia was not the serial killer that history made her out to be. And there's a lot of evidence that got really overstated in sort of the legend of the Borgias, right? There were stories that they had invented these, incredibly lethal versions of arsenic. There were stories that one of the Borgias, who was a pope, actually had the secret recipe down in the archives of the Vatican, right? There were all of these stories that were sort of built around them. But when you actually look at how they tended to kill people, they like knives a lot better than poison. And the other thing about poison, even though I'm telling you how great it is people get the dose wrong all the time, right? They're trying to kill someone and they miscalculate the dose, and people survive and they go to prison. So poison is not nearly as efficient as cutting someone's throat quite often, and the Borgias preferred that kind of method. But there were other early poisoners, right? The affair of the poison in the court of Louis the Sun King with Catherine de Shays, that was arsenic poisoning primarily, and that stretched all the way up to the king's mistress. Right. So we know that in those early centuries, there was a lot of sort of cultural acceptance of arsenic as an inheritance powder. Poison is a solution to your problems. Right. I think that kind of runs through the backstory of who we are.
How can doctors recognize these poisons in their sick patients?
So some of them really fly signal flags. Actually, cyanide does, right? It discolors the skin. It's a corrosive poison. Often people, they find discolored or corroded or even bloody tissues in the mouth. Or if I take something like carbon monoxide, which has been a homicidal poison, but it, is today still a very dangerous poison. If you're poisoned by carbon monoxide, your skin will turn a flush pink and your organs will flush pink. Carbon monoxide pushes oxygen out of the red blood cells. And as it does so, it discolors them. And so it's very easy to see a carbon monoxide death just by looking at the corpse. People will say that people who die of carbon monoxide poisoning are the healthiest corpses they've ever seen because they've got this beautiful rose flush to their skin quite often, right? There are others that cause other skin discoloration. There are others, I'm going to say something like strychnine, that are really visible poison because the symptoms are so visible. The convulsions are so visible, say, right? Whereas arsenic is harder to detect. We know how to detect arsenic in a corpse, I should say, right? We regulated and arsenic actually sticks around in hair and fingernails and stuff for a while, so you can find it quite a long time after death. And if I pick one other sort of obvious but more modern poison, antifreeze, has been favored by a number of homicidal killers in this century in particular. And antifreeze, or diethylene glycol, as we metabolize it, eventually forms crystals that lodge in your kidneys, which is how it kills you, right? It sort of slices and dices your kidneys. And if you know what to look for, if you suspect that and you know what to look for, those crystals are like flying flags of poisoning, right? You might think, oh, that's just, a disease, a kidney disease death. But if you look, you'll see those shining little crystals in the tissue.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
How does one go about poisoning somebody else with antifreeze? Because you said that there were some examples of killers who have used antifreeze. So that's my first question. And the crystals, could those be mistaken for something else?
They're pretty distinctive. They have almost angled envelope-like shape. So anyone can go out and buy antifreeze. No one is going to suspect you if you go and get antifreeze for your car. The trick that's happened more recently is that manufacturers, at least some manufacturers voluntarily, have added a bittering agent to antifreeze. So the poison in antifreeze is ethylene glycol or diethylene glycol. There's two variants of this. And it tastes great. It's kind of sweet, right? It's a mild, sweet flavor. It's one of the reasons that we had all these problems with pets. Dogs would lick the antifreeze if it spilled on the floor and it would kill them. Actually, this is an interesting backstory. Pet owners kept pushing Congress to put a bittering agent in antifreeze, not because of people, but because it was killing so many pets, right? And the Humane Society lobbied, could never get Congress to do it. I've never been able to figure out why they wouldn't. It seems like it would have been an easy thing. But finally, the antifreeze manufacturers signed an agreement to make it bitter so you could taste it. People who have gone to kill people with antifreeze, and they found this when they've searched their hard drives after the killings, if they get caught, go and search for forms, brands of antifreeze that are not bittered because it's so tasteless by nature. There was a woman who killed a couple of husbands in Georgia, and she put it in Jell-O, right? It's just like completely tasteless. And so there was a woman, and it's quite a famous case, the Diane Stouty case. I'm pretty sure that was Missouri. She killed her husband, her son, and then tried to kill one of her daughters every single time using antifreeze and putting it in Coke or Red Bull or whatever their favorite drinks were. And she got caught when she failed to correctly kill her youngest daughter. And that case has gotten a lot of attention because the cops put the video of her confession online, right? So you can actually go and watch them interview her to the point that she finally admits that she did this. But that's what she said. She picked antifreeze because it's a tasteless poison. You could buy it without being suspected. It mimics the symptoms of a natural illness, a natural kidney disease, right? You had to know, and this goes back to your questions about how you detect it. You have to know to look for it. The standard tox screen doesn't always include antifreeze. And so you have to have a suspicious doctor or someone who tips off the police or someone that says, that sure could be antifreeze poisoning. Let's actually look at the kidneys. So you have to have all of that come together, right? We don't leap to poison first thing as the conclusion.
Now, is there a way to recognize that before the patient's death?
That's a good question because there are antidotes to antifreeze poisoning. And actually, if you were at home, I can actually give you good advice in this. If you were at home and you accidentally had stored your antifreeze, this actually happened one time in an orange juice container and glugged some up. That's actually a story I got from a poison control center, right? The antidote from that is to go out and chug a bottle of wine, right? Because ethylene glycol is an alcohol, and you can disrupt its metabolism by drinking another alcohol. If for any reason you suspect that someone is poisoning you with antifreeze, obviously it's better to call the police, and there are better antidotes in hospital. But you can treat yourself by just glugging down some wine or beer or, whiskey. That's a really good question. The thing is with antifreeze poisoning, mostly you're just going to feel lousy, right? You're going to have flu-like kind of symptoms, right? You're going to be achy. You're going to have a stomach ache. You're going to feel generally like you're coming down with something. It's not going to specifically shout antifreeze poisoning, right? So somewhere in there has to be suspicion. And with the Stouty case, I know that one pretty well. What happened was the husband died, no one suspected anything. The son died, no one suspected anything except that her pastor, she was a lovely church-going woman in community eyes, was kind of bothered by the fact that she seemed fairly indifferent at the funeral services, right? And then the daughter got sick, and at that point it was the pastor who went to the police. He just was like, there's this pattern in this family, it's making me really uncomfortable. The girl was not dead. She actually brought her some kind of drink in the hospital that had more antifreeze in it. By that time, they had seen the classic symptoms, and they were giving her antidotes in the hospital, and she survived. But a lot of times with poison, it's going to be one of two things. You're going to have a fast-acting poison like strychnine or aconitine that just rolls you out right away. You might think, well, I feel really crummy, and then, you can be dead in less than half an hour. With something like antifreeze or some of the classic arsenic poisonings, you just get sick. You feel crummy. You have a stomach ache. You throw up. Your throat's sore. You don't necessarily think someone's trying to kill me. People do. There was an antifreeze poisoning case. Now, as you see, I know so much of this stuff, I do sound creepy. In Wisconsin, her name was Julie. I can't remember her husband's name. And he killed her with antifreeze. He kept saying, let's sit down and have a drink together. And he'd put the antifreeze in the wine. And she suspected that he was trying to kill her. And she wrote a letter, which her brother got after her death, that said, this is what I suspect is going on. I mean, you have to say, why didn't she leave, right? But there's all kinds of issues involved in, very dysfunctional relationships. She stayed, he killed her, and the district attorney was able to do the end run. And this is why it's an interesting legal case. The requirement that you get to face your accuser in person. It's part of the American judicial system. He was able to get the court to accept that letter as part of the evidence. And they were able to show that she had been killed by antifreeze, and he went to jail. And he kept appealing it based on, that legal loophole that the DA had kind of wiggled his way through. But I don't think Jensen, his last name was Jensen, ever got out of prison. So you don't necessarily you start to say, I don't trust this person and I'm feeling crummy. And frankly, if you say, I don't trust this person, and I've noticed that when I have dinner with them or whatever, I'm starting to feel really bad, I would leave. Yeah, it's easy for me to say that. I'm not in a relationship with a homicidal partner, right? But if you thought you were in that pattern, it might be worth your time to step back a little and just see what happened if you weren't eating dinner with the suspect person. Does that make sense?
Oh, for sure. One question on that. So he killed her with antifreeze, but you said that he was putting it in her wine. So was the wine not able to have that antidote capability if it was mixed directly together?
It wasn't enough, right?
It wasn't enough wine.
Yeah. I mean, you really have to flood the system with alcohol. I mean, you can't just say, I'll just have a drink. And I remember talking to people. I was talking about the pet issue with some vets, and they were talking about before they came up with a very specific ethylene glycol antidote, dogs would come in with antifreeze poisoning, and then I'd have a drunk dog in my clinic because they would give the dog so much. They would just inject ethanol, right? Ethanol's the alcohol you get in wine and beer and cocktails and whatever. And they would just do an IV flooding them with ethanol, and the dogs would be drunk and staggering around the clinic, right? So you have to really overwhelm the system with alcohol, right? A little is not going to do it. That's a smart question because I didn't make that clear.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to make sure that what I was doing in my 20s was actually proactively fighting the effects of antifreeze poisoning.
That's right. If you were getting loaded in your 20s, you were totally protected from antifreeze poisoning.
Yeah, I just had my suspicions, and I just needed to ensure that this was not going to happen. So,
right. Yeah, that makes me feel better about my 20s, too.
Yeah, same. Now, is poison used as a weapon more by women?
It's interesting, right? So I'm going to get all down in the weeds for a minute with FBI statistics. When you look at the choice of poison as a weapon, women choose poison about 7 times as often as men. They preferentially choose poison. And actually, if you look at serial killers, the choice is even higher. The number of serial killers who are women who, as opposed to men who choose poison is even higher than that 7%, right? If you look at poisonings overall, just, straight numbers, men poison as much or more than women just because men are more homicidal than women, right? It's like, 90% of all homicides are committed by men. So you kind of have those numbers weighting it. But women choose poison. And there's a lot of discussion over why. Some of it is that poison is non-confrontational. I know early on when guns became more widely available in the United States, for instance, criminologists thought, women are going to rush. They'll have as many guns as men. There'll be as many firearm homicides committed by women as men. That never happened. Men are still vastly the majority of firearms homicides. And part of that is that when you look at homicides, a woman who has a gun in the presence of a man who's very angry, the gun doesn't always protect her. And all of us have seen cases where the man just grabs the gun and kills the woman, right? So some of it is that, you're able to do this without putting yourself at personal risk. Some of it, I think, is that women incline toward kind of being planners. That used to be the joke when I was in school, girls with all their little binders and color-coded stickers and everything. And I don't want to stereotype who we are. Men have binders and color-coded stickers too. But it is true that women tend to be kind of plan-ahead personalities, and that really suits what a poisoner is. People have argued throughout history that poison is kind of an equalizer for women, and certainly there's a science historian, Daniel Kevles, who looked at the 19th century and called poison the great equalizer. The idea that poison is an equalizer is kind of a balance of power issue. For instance, in 19th century Britain, where if you were a married woman, you lost all right to property, you couldn't get a divorce, you couldn't leave a will, women couldn't work at jobs that men had. They had no power. If they were in a bad relationship, they couldn't get out of the bad relationship because they couldn't get a divorce. But they had access, as we were talking about, to arsenic and cyanide and strychnine and all of the antimony and all of these different things in the kitchen cupboards and in the bathroom cupboards. And so they were able to use it as a form of escape. I don't see that as much today. And I will say one other thing, and that is when people sort of parse the motives of serial killers, and we're not in the golden age of serial killers that we saw in the late 20th century, I think, for a whole bunch of different reasons. It's easier to get caught than it was then. But in general, when you look at the habits of serial killers, you'll see that women will kill more often for money or financial gain. That's a category sometimes called comfort killers. You kill for your personal comfort, right? Whereas the classic male serial killers were less about comfort and more about certain needs or torture needs or deviant needs, right? If you look at a Bundy or you looked at the toolbox killers down in Los Angeles or some of the other really classic killers of the time, they weren't looking to enrich themselves. You see that enrichment thread running through a lot of female poisoners. It doesn't make them good people. They're not good people. But I think when you're thinking about enriching yourself and you're thinking about ways that I can do that and not get caught, again, going back to planning, comfort killers choose poison. They can get away with it. They can move on. That doesn't make them less dangerous. That just makes them more careful. And poison is a careful weapon.
And we'll be right back after a quick word from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsors, and now we're back to the program.
In your opinion, who is the most prolific poisoner?
So if you look online there, you will see people referring to Julius Tofana, who was an Italian Roman poisoner of kind of medieval times. And people will say, and she is linked to 600 deaths But I think, and I did a lot of research on this for the book I'm working on, that she was more part of a network of people. She sold poison. Aqua Tofana was the name of it. Mozart, when he died, if you go and look at his letters as he was dying, wrote and said he thought he had been killed by Aqua Tofana, which was the poison developed by Giulia Tofana in Rome. It was a super famous arsenic-based poison. But she was really at a core or a network of female poisoners. And if you looked at that as a kind of communal poisoning, you would see that probably there were hundreds and hundreds of deaths related to her. There are other individual poisoners. You can say, wow, that single woman killed dozens of people. Jane Toppin, who was a nurse in Boston in the late 19th century. People have tried to figure out whether she killed only 30 people or 100 people because she was so successful as a poisoner, an unsuspected poisoner for so long. Marianne Cott, there's a book about her called Britain's First Female Serial Killer. I'm not sure she was the first, but she certainly was the first well-documented female serial killer. People think she may have killed a couple dozen people before she got caught. I started saying to my friends, why don't we know these people? They've killed a lot more people than some of the famous male serial killers, right? But it's just not as flashy and dramatic and Criminal Minds-ish, right, as some of the more deviant male serial killers. But these women are really successful.
Yeah, it seems almost more of an investigation might be needed in some cases, certainly science-based investigation. How is it possible to prove these kinds of poisons in court? Can that be a difficult process?
I mean, not so much today, but if I go back again to the 19th century. So at the start of the 19th century, there was no way to chemically detect a poison in a corpse. No way at all. If you suspected someone had been poisoned, your best bet was to feed their last meal to a dog and see if the dog died, something like that. And there's a lot of sacrificed dogs in this story, unfortunately, but that was one of the things that they would do. And that changed, I want to say a little before 1840, there was a British chemist named James Marsh who gave testimony in an arsenic murder, was not able to do convincing testimony. The killer walked away and then mocked him. I was able to get away with this. I really did it. Can't be tried again. Double jeopardy. And Marsh was just obsessed with figuring this out, and he developed a very primitive test called the Marsh test to detect arsenic. And that led to our very gradual ability to detect arsenic and other metal-based poisons. Arsenic's a metalloid element, so lead and copper and antimony and this whole group of sort of metallic poisons. Eventually, we developed a way to test for them if you suspected it. First, you have to suspect. Right. And then we didn't get back to plant alkaloids, like I was saying, like strychnine, say, or cyanide, until about 1870. And that was the first one that they figured out there was nicotine. There was a double murder in France, and there was a Belgian chemist who was also extremely obsessive, and he figured out nicotine. And then you get the flood of industrial poisons, right? It's the late 9th century, the rise of industrial chemistry, all of these things that spill into the market from benzene to chloroform, right? We don't know how to detect them in a corpse. We don't know what the lethal level is. Wood alcohol in the 1920s with the rise of prohibition again. So in this period that I was writing about in Poisoner's Handbook, they're figuring this out. We've got better at that now, and that we can detect. I was going on and on about arsenic at the part per billion level. We can detect at the part per billion level. They certainly couldn't do anything close to that, right, early in toxicology. Some poisons, very few poisons, will kill at an extremely tiny level like that, but most poisons are detectable if you know what to look for and you know what they are at this point. At some level in this process, unless it's a fast-acting convulsive poison like strychnine, say, you have to have some suspicious person in the mix. There was a case, I want to say this was maybe 15-ish years ago. There was a doctor, he was a neuroscientist, I think, at the University of Pittsburgh, killed his wife, who was I think she was an aging researcher. Anyway, he killed his wife. She was another faculty member with cyanide. She was drinking these drinks because she was creatine, I think. She was trying to get pregnant, and he laced it with cyanide, and it killed her. And no one suspected him until one of the doctors in the hospital was trying to figure out why she was showing some symptoms that suggest her muscles were being starved of oxygen. Right. And cyanide does a kind of chemical suffocation like that. And he actually just randomly ran a test for cyanide, and they found it in her bloodstream. Then when they went backwards and sort of did the investigation, he was so confident he was going to get away with this because normally we don't test for cyanide anymore because it's a very restricted substance and hard to get. No one suspects it. But he was so confident he was going to get away with it, he had ordered the cyanide on his department credit card. Right. So he actually, I know. That's my favorite part of that story, the humorous of it.
Loser.
Right? So he was, in fact, convicted and went to jail. But there's sometime in any of these, it's the great Agatha Christie thing, someone has to be suspicious. If someone does not get suspicious, and this is not me saying go ye out and poison, because a lot of times people are suspicious, or there are symptoms, or the death doesn't make sense in a healthy person, and all of these things that trigger an investigation. But someone has to be suspicious in the process. And that's why we train doctors and toxicologists and forensic investigators to be very, very suspicious, right, when an unexpected death happens. And that's why if it's an unexpected death in your family, you should always ask for an autopsy and at least some kind of basic tox screen. I would, if it was an unexpected death in my family, right? After I wrote Poisoner's Handbook, I used to hear from people all the time who were convinced that their relatives had killed someone in their family. And a guy wrote me, he thought his sister-in-law had poisoned his brother, and she'd immediately had the body cremated. But he had rushed down to the mortuary and ripped the hair out of his dead brother's head so he could have it tested for chemical compounds. The symptoms said that he should test for, and I sent him to a local toxicologist. I mean, I'm a failed chemist. I'm a toxicology journalist. I'm not a toxicologist. So when push comes to shove, I don't pretend to be a toxicologist. No, I'm someone who knows a lot about poison, but that's not the same thing. Yeah, you totally should have that element with an unexpected death. If you don't have a clear explanation and you are suspicious in some way, do the tests. Do justice to someone in your family if you're suspicious. I completely believe that. And my husband used to say to me when I got into this, and he goes, and if I die, everyone's going to know it's you.
Or it's like, it's so obvious it can't be.
Yeah, that's true too. No one will ever suspect me.
Yeah. Well, on that, are there any deaths out there that have occurred that you are suspicious of being poisoned that just haven't been determined yet? Like any assassinations or any untimely deaths?
I mean, occasionally, right? There was a lot of questions about whether Yasser Arafat was poisoned, right? I don't think he was, but there was a lot of debate about that. Unexpected deaths of, political figures, right? Those suddenly fall ill when they were healthy. But I will tell you this, in those kind of cases with well-known political figures, there's poisoners who try to do stuff really deviously, and there are people in political power who don't try to be devious at all because they're making a statement with the death. So a classic example of that would have been the polonium-210 poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in England. Do you remember this? He was a Russian dissident who had moved to London, and Putin sent a couple of what we can fairly call assassins to meet with him and discuss his untoward behavior. And they had tea together, and these guys put the radioactive element polonium-210 in the tea. Polonium-210, like radium, is an alpha emitter. You have to swallow it for it to be dangerous, right? Remember I was talking about poisons being devious? So one of the interesting things about radium and polonium-210, and they're in the same decay chain, is that they structurally look to the body like calcium. So if you swallow them, this is what happened to the watch-dial painters in the 1920s when they would swallow radium-based paint. If you swallow them, the body looks at the physical structure of radium or polonium-210 and deposits it to the bone. And once you've got a radioactive element deposits in your bones, the way calcium would deposit to your bones, it just starts destroying the bones and the bone marrow from within. And so he died of polonium-210 radiation poisoning. They couldn't do anything to save him. When they figured it out, they were actually able to trace the radioactive trails of these guys. There was a British Airways aircraft that had to be stripped down because the seats were so radioactive, right? They were just trailing alpha irradiation everywhere. But he wasn't trying to hide that. I mean, they couldn't prove that he had ordered it, obviously, but he wanted to send a message to other dissidents. A lot of those sort of political deaths, they're not trying to be secretive. They're trying to send a message, right? It's different from, Ray Jensen killing his wife with antifreeze and hoping to get away with it.
So if there's anyone out there who works at a supermarket or Cumberland Farms and you see somebody coming through and they buy antifreeze and a little package of Jell-O, you should probably call the cops.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. That would be hilarious.
Right. I might actually do that at the Cumberland Farms down the street. I'll just get some antifreeze and some Jell-O and just see what their reaction is.
See if anyone reports you. Right.
Not a responsible thing for me to do.
Well, it would be funny. Sorry. You have to take poison humor where you get it, right? I do think that if anyone ever searched my hard drive, especially after spending 2 years researching a book about female poisoners, I should probably wipe the whole thing. It's just such a lethal hard drive, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Can you tell us a little bit about the book you're working on now? I know it's tentatively titled The Women's Weapon.
It really goes back to something we talked about earlier, which is the idea that we underestimate women as murderers, and we especially underestimate women as serial killers. It actually started, I was in a book conversation at the Mark Twain House and Museum with another true crime writer, and he had written a book about a male serial killer who was a poisoner, Neil Cream. His name's Dean Job, and the book is about Neil Cream, who was a doctor who would put strychnine in gel caps. It was actually pretty brilliant. He would put strychnine in gel caps, and the gel cap would take a while to dissolve. So even though strychnine is, dramatic poison, he'd be gone. He went off from that to talking about, your standard issue serial killers, Ted Bundy, everyone knows him, John Wayne Gacy, et cetera, et cetera. And I was kind of like, wait a minute, right? We go on and on about these guys, but they didn't kill as many people as some of the women that I know from writing about poison, and how come we're always underestimating women? So I went to my editor, my agent, and I said, I want to write a female empowerment book about female poisoners. That was really the idea, give women the credit for just how bad we can be. And so that was the start of the book. It's evolved since then. It's really hard to write a whole book celebrating really terrible people. And some of these are really terrible people. So I've used the book instead to look at how female poisoners tell us about who we are. There's a chapter about the folklore of monsters and serial killers, right? And the way the serial killers of the past have illuminated our folklore legends and fairy tales in some really interesting ways. And that's built around a really terrible Norwegian immigrant serial killer in the early 20th century who moved to Indiana and was like a spider pulling her victims in. There's a chapter about women and witchcraft, right? And that follows the story of a Georgia serial killer who, just in case the arsenic didn't work, cursed her victims, right? And met with root doctors and black magic practitioners. So I used that to look at women and poison and witchcraft and what that tells us about that connection. I did one chapter about something we've talked about here, camouflage. Actually, there's a quite famous, if you live in Connecticut, serial killer there, Amy Archer Gilligan, who inspired a play called Arsenic and Old Lace. And the author of that play went up to Windsor, Connecticut and researched Amy before he wrote the play. And so I used her to look at how female poisoners, she poisoned for years, she killed dozens of people, are able to stay in hiding so effectively. What is it that allows women to hide so beautifully as they kill people? And so the book is more about those kinds of issues, less a celebration and more as we look at these people, what do they tell us about who we are, right? What we see, what we choose not to see. And that's been really fascinating and fun. Of course, it's still a lot of really good murder stories and some very cool poisons. So, good way. So I'll tell you one other really quick story, which is actually out of the book I haven't published yet. But during this period in the 19th century where women were so powerless, one of the cases that came up was a group of women in a little factory town in England, and they were using the poison antimony. If you look at the periodic table, it's sort of shoulder to shoulder with arsenic, very similar. And their husbands, who would come home drunk and abusive, right, they would just put a little antimony in their tea, and then they would, not feel very well and go to bed and not be so dangerous or annoying. Eventually they got caught when, like I said, it's difficult to get the dose, and one woman used too much and killed her husband, and the whole thing unraveled. But they called antimony the quiet, right? That was how they saw it. And there's something in that, that just brings the whole thing to life. It's not exactly funny, but it's so human, right? And I love that part of it too.
Yeah, totally.
Wow. Well, thank you so much, Deborah, for hanging out with us today and telling us about your work and about poison. It's really fascinating stuff.
Thank you so much for having me on. I'm a fan of your podcast, and I was really thrilled when you reached out. It's been a pleasure.